Whenever I started to do stuff, that's like Tuesday or something.
Oh, it's not letting me start up anyway. So, oh, it's connecting.
Are there any additions or deletions to the agenda? Okay, hearing none, all those in favor? Contrary minded, motion is carried. Next is the approval of minutes from the May 8th meeting. May I have a motion to that effect? Jenny, thank you. Nathalie, seconding. Are there any errors or omissions in those minutes? Hearing none, all in favor? Contrary minded, motion is carried. No business arising from the minutes, so moving right on to the new business. Item 6.1 is the 2023 Old Town Lunenburg State of Conservation Information Report, and I assume, Hillary, I'll be turning that over to you or Arthur.
Thank you very much. Through the chair, sorry, I don't want to break anyone's ears if I'm buzzing. On May 23rd, Council endorsed the 2023 Old Town Lunenburg State of Conservation Report, and it was sent to Parks Canada May 25th. Please note that the State of Conservation Report was adopted with minor edits not included in your agenda package, edits that were made at the request of the Lunenburg Academy Foundation and the Lunenburg Heritage Society. The amended version is now available on the town's website, on the Heritage Conservation District and Bylaws page. Parks Canada requested this report, and it will form the basis of staff's 6-year periodic reporting to Parks Canada and Parks Canada's subsequent report to the World Heritage Committee. There are 4 or 5 World Heritage sites in Canada that submit state of conservation reports annually. These are voluntary reports, and this will be the most substantial report we have submitted in some time. The periodic reports submitted every 6 years are obligatory. The report finds that Old Town Lunenburg is the most under-resourced World Heritage Site in Canada. Protecting Old Town Lunenburg on behalf of the global community has fallen disproportionately on the town, its residents, and its businesses versus the provincial or federal government when compared to other Canadian World Heritage Sites. I cannot stress enough that our residents, business owners, and organizations are heroes of Canada's heritage conservation movement and should be celebrated for their dedication and perseverance in conserving Old Town Lunenburg. As context, there are 9 cultural World Heritage Sites in Canada. Of those 9, 2 are owned and operated by the government of Alberta. Each of the other 9 are at least partly owned and operated by Parks Canada and managed as interpretive sites. Town staff has requested the last 5 years of capital and operating budgets for each of these Parks Canada owned and operated sites, and the Government of Canada has yet to supply us with these numbers. While this has yet to be confirmed, it appears Parks Canada owned and operated National Historic Sites have an annual operating budget of approximately $1 million to $4 million, $1 million being for sites only open for a part of the year. Lunenburg can apply for funding under Parks Canada's National Cost Sharing Program, competing against the country's other sites for 50% matching funding up to $250,000 a year. Only $2 million has been allocated to this fund for 2023-2024. Again, to put this in perspective, Town Hall needs $3.8 million in exterior conservation alone, almost double the cost sharing fund's budget for the entire year for all of Canada. Meanwhile, between 2010 and 2020, the federal government invested $46 million in restoring the fortifications of Quebec City, also a World Heritage site, World Heritage town, if you will. Again, it is incredible that Lunenburg has done so much for so long with so little. This report is in no way meant to detract from what has been achieved here. Yet, despite everyone's best efforts, the state of Old Town Lunenburg World Heritage Site is poor, and its status as North America's best preserved colonial settlement is in jeopardy because of the critical condition of the 4 civic blocks in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary. A very thorough report indeed. Are there any questions from the committee to Hilary at this time? Yes, Fawn.
Still the new person. Thank you, Hilary. And indeed, there was a lot of information here, and I had to study quite a bit. Especially, there's a few things I'm particularly interested in. And first is the threats against that we are facing as a town. And you have 5 listed there. And I certainly understand all of those. What would, does population decline ever show as a threat in a case like this? So for example, Lunenburg, when the original settlers came, were about almost 1,500. And in the 1950s, it went up to 4,000, and the town accommodated all of that and grew as a result. And, you know, extra buildings were added, that kind of thing. And now we're down to 2,500, still having to take care of the heritage and the buildings that, as a result, that were created. So does population decline? Is that a threat to, that would be under the, you know, something that we would have to, to me, it would speak to how much we can support. So.
Through the chair, excellent question. Well, a decline in resident numbers would, of course, have a major impact in a decline in tax revenue, which could hinder the amount of management that the town could undertake. Certainly, if the numbers were to dip so low, especially when faced with Nova Scotia's aging population, that especially character-defining properties, so the properties that contribute to our World Heritage status were, for example, left vacant, that could be a very serious concern. These things certainly are on our radar as staff, but the threats that we chose to highlight in this report in particular were considered the most imminent. So the ones that stand to have the most pronounced impact on our World Heritage status in the next 12 months, 24 months, et cetera, where those population trends tend to play out on a slightly longer time scale. So for example, the state of the civic blocks, if they were to continue to decline and, for example, no longer be used as public use, that would be almost an immediate potential death knell for the district and its UNESCO status.
Right. Well, vice versa, does it help us get any grants if it's seen that our population has dropped and they really want us to stay as a UNESCO site? Like either way, does it? No.
Again, currently the only funding that, again, through the chair, currently the only funding that is open to us is the National Cost Sharing Program. my understanding is that they don't ask for any of those sorts of demographic information. And again, they have a regional cross-Canada mandate, and we are competing against every other national historic site in the country every time we apply to that fund. So as far as I'm aware, that doesn't factor into any of Parks Canada's decision-making.
Okay, thank you.
But again, I can't speak for them or what conversations they could be having. I can only judge by publicly available information.
If I may, through the chair, just to add to Hillary's points, not only is population decline a possible threat, it's the change in the nucleus of a family. The property ownership went from like 2.4 people per household, and most of those households had 2 incomes to support the maintenance of our building stock. Now that is changing to a 1-income family, single parents and smaller households, around 1.4, 1.5 people per family household now. So that alone is it's almost like a double threat. The decline in population as well as the change in the family unit with regards to property ownership. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you, Hillary and Arthur and Fawn for the question. Are there any other questions? Okay, I have Oliver next.
I wonder if I'd just make a comment on that subject. I mean, obviously there are real issues about population decline, but I don't know that it so much affects the issue about the maintenance of the historic fabric. It's worth remembering that one of the things that has contributed to population decline is the number of properties in Old Town which are actually owned by seasonal residents, and many of them are people with the money to have restored the properties, very well. So, I mean, it's not as if we've got large numbers of properties which just sit vacant and fall down.
Thank you, Oliver. Are there any other questions of the committee? No, well, then I thank you, Hillary, for your report, and we will move on to item 6.2, which is the new Old Town Lunenburg Heritage Conservation District Plan and Bylaw Information Report.
Thank you so much. First, just some information to put on the record and for those who are attending the meeting this evening. Staff has divided the committee's consideration of the new heritage property plan and bylaw tonight into 2 items to clarify for the public what the committee is voting on this evening versus future meetings. So as we will see shortly, there are many steps left between tonight and this draft plan and bylaw potentially coming into effect. So first, and this is the report I'm about to give, the committee will receive an information report on the new Old Town Lunenburg Heritage Conservation District Plan and Bylaw. That's before you. Then the committee will vote on a public participation schedule. And this schedule includes a timeline for the committee to receive feedback and make their recommendation to council. So again, this is an opportunity to ask questions, to provide feedback, but certainly no formal recommendation is being sought this evening. So as you all know, the town has been working on a new heritage conservation plan and bylaw for some time. And this is a vital project, not only because it protects Lunenburg's heritage for the local community, but because the town of Lunenburg is the legislated authority to protect Old Town Lunenburg World Heritage Site, and adequate legal protection is a requirement to its World Heritage listing. The current Heritage Conservation Plan and Bylaw enacted in 2000, while thorough in many respects, does not conform to national or international best practices. In particular, it does not take a value-based approach to conservation and does not adequately protect all Old Town's universal values. The 2000 plan also does not address critical issues like research, documentation, accessibility, and inclusivity that are crucial to Old Town's conservation. Adopting a new updated heritage conservation district plan and bylaw that follows best practices will greatly improve Old Town's protection and management, and thus Old Town's state of conservation moving forward. Value-based conservation has been widely accepted as best practice since the 1990s and is recommended in the operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention. At its most basic level, this means that the conservation process is supposed to begin and be led by identifying heritage values and the tangible and intangible elements that carry that heritage value. Character-defining elements and heritage values exist in a reciprocal, almost mutually reinforcing relationship. So the place has no value without these elements, which are worth conserving because of their heritage value. It's a little bit of circular thinking. Old Town Lunenburg is recognized as a World Heritage Site for 3 reasons or values. It is the best preserved colonial settlement in North America. It is home to a rich marine culture, and it is home to a continuing vernacular architecture tradition. To clarify what buildings contribute to Old Town Lunenburg's international and local significance, each building in the district has been deemed character defining. It contributes to the World Heritage designation because it is a vernacular structure. Some have been deemed locally significant, so it is of local historical value and will be protected, but does not necessarily contribute to the World Heritage designation because it is not a vernacular structure, and supporting buildings of relatively minimal architectural significance that still do not detract from the overall character of the district. To ensure the integrity and authenticity of a historic place, character-defining elements, including individual buildings, must be treated with the utmost care, following a minimal intervention approach. Any interventions in the district should be legible upon close inspection and thoroughly documented. The district should also be studied to ensure conservation is based on sound research. New development is not prohibited under this new draft plan and bylaw, but it must be visually, physically, and stylistically compatible with surrounding character-defining or vernacular structures. Proposals for new structures that are incompatible, dominating, or indistinguishable from the district's vernacular structures and the heritage value of the district will not be permitted. New buildings must be inspired by historic buildings of the same type, whether that be civic, commercial, or residential. The World Heritage Committee recognized Old Town Lunenburg as being of outstanding universal value because of its continuing vernacular architecture tradition, emphasis on continuing. It has in fact noted the lack of infill as a weakness of the district. As such, the new plan seeks to encourage infill development and neo-vernacular design, or contemporary interpretations of Lunenburg's vernacular building tradition. For example, in sections 2.2.4 and 2.3.4 in the bylaws design guidelines, there are lists of traditional trim and ornamentation, and new commercial and residential construction must include 4 of each, perhaps details inspired by friezes or dentils, scrolls, brackets, or eaves, along with the corner boards and window and door trim addressed in the current bylaw. The new plan and bylaw also clarify the part of Old Town's UNESCO designation is its continuing functioning along the original Charles Morris colonial plan. Again, the continued public function of the 4 civic blocks is absolutely integral to Old Town's World Heritage listing. The new plan and bylaw also seeks to encourage marine activity at the waterfront because marine activities are also essential to Lunenburg's marine culture and is an essential component of its World Heritage listing. An important change between the existing plan and bylaw and the current draft new Heritage Conservation District Plan and bylaw is the district's boundary. The district's boundary has been expanded to encompass all of the World Heritage Buffer Zone. This was done in response to public input and was discussed with the committee at its last meeting. You'll also note that this new plan and bylaw requires fewer public hearings. Only applications to demolish character-defining and locally significant structures will be referred to the Heritage Advisory Committee and a public hearing, and applications should not be approved unless there is irreversible structural damage. The bylaw demands 2 engineering reports that testify to this before a demolition application can be considered. However, the Heritage Officer may, at their discretion, refer any application for a certificate of appropriateness to the Heritage Advisory Committee and is directed to pay particular attention to substantial alterations, including additions greater than 25% of an existing building's footprint, new public buildings, new commercial buildings, and proposals where heritage values may be in conflict. For example, substantially altering a marine vernacular building, which would be a character-defining element, to facilitate continued maritime use. In this case, both the vernacular building and the continued marine use of the building would contribute to Old Town's outstanding universal value. And as such, these values would need to be carefully balanced. Lastly, I want to draw your attention to policies 14, 15, and 60 under the plan. Based on earlier meetings, these policies may be of particular interest to the committee because they work to grapple with Old Town's coloniality and lack of accessibility. Both these were deemed urgent matters in the 2023 State of Conservation Report. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions of the committee right now on this report? Yes, Oliver, thank you.
Well, I just don't, I'm in your hands, Mr. Chairman, about what's the appropriate way to go about this. I've jotted down a number of things, some very little, some rather more significant. I mean, do you want me to sort of
Sure.
throw my list at you? Right. Well, first of all, it's a very small grammatical thing, but it runs right through. And that is, there's many references to principal facades, doors, etc. And quite often it's correctly spelt, and quite often it's spelled LE. I don't know what word processing program that this is produced by, but if it's one that has find and replace, it needs to get rid of all the LE ones, of which there's 100 at least. The next thing is, I'm very impressed by the detailed listing of, I don't know, it's what, about 20 or so different buildings and their things, but I'm puzzled that the Knott-Ruland House doesn't feature there. Because it seems to me it really should as a national historic site. And since we're trying to raise many hundreds of thousands for its restoration, it might help if we can quote that it's in there. And in that section, there's obviously a small glitch under the St. John's Rectory, because there's a reference to it as being the hall. I think that's a small copy and paste error, but I just picked that up. Moving from the rectory to churches, I'm not quite clear about this. I mean, obviously, the maintenance of the exterior of the churches is integral to the whole setup. To what extent might that preclude or not preclude adaptation of part or all of the interior? And that is likely to be a real issue before very long in relation to Zion Lutheran Church, who are looking at the possibility of doing some quite different things. And I wouldn't want us to pass a bylaw that would inhibit the imaginative reuse of part of that. But it can be done, I think, without changing the exterior. I'm not entirely clear about the status of the buffer zone in relation to all of this. I mean, do all the same requirements apply within the buffer zone, or are they limited to the real Old Town zone? And I think that in the light of the fact that in relation to the old Heritage bylaw, the question about solar panels came up and I know has caused a lot of anxiety, I would say, particularly to those people whose houses are on the north side of cross streets and who are therefore not really allowed to have solar panels. We've debated that one before. I'm not saying it needs to be changed, but I think we really need to talk about it. And I'm honestly not clear whether the technology which has existed in Europe for at least 20 years has spread to North America yet. And that's the business of tiles which double as solar collectors. Because I think if that becomes available, we really should probably like to permit that. And it at least needs to be sort of faced up to. And I would feel it was more defensible to ban solar panels if the town of Lunenburg were going the same route as the town of Home Bay and generating some of its electricity through a solar farm. So long as we're not doing that, and if some of you know, I speak as somebody who's got a lot of land outside of Old Town, on which I have 78 solar panels, which generate 75% of my electricity. So I'm sort of committed to that. There's a little mention at the end about the fact that there's a hope eventually to produce some pictures. And I would say yes, yes, yes. I mean, because that's a clear change. And I do think that on all of this, you know, pictures speaking thousands of words is very true. I mean, we had lots of little diagrams showing you can't do this and you can do that in relation to fences and steps and all of those things. And I do think that's good. The one other thing I've got down is, and I'm afraid some of you have heard me on this one before, I'm unconvinced about the requirement in new buildings that the windows must be of sash type. I mean, I think this is really an issue about how you deal with things fitting in and reflecting the vernacular architecture, and yet still not being pastiche, but being genuinely 21st century. In the 21st century, people do not put sash windows in new buildings unless they are deliberately imitating an earlier style of architecture. I mean, when my own house was being designed, which was designed by a very eminent heritage architect, we had quite some debate about this. And I'm totally in favor of the vertical dimension must be significantly larger than the horizontal dimension. That is definitely characteristic of our traditional architecture here. But I would say that sash windows are part of a gradual historical evolution of window styles. And that evolution has been largely driven by the development of the technology of glass making. The so-called 6/6 window was current in the period when people couldn't make very big pieces of glass without a lot of distortion. As glass making improved, so people moved to windows such as are in this room. By roughly speaking, the First World War, sash windows were falling out of style. I know that London is different from Lunenburg in all kinds of ways, but I can say the parish I had there, it was very easy to identify the period of at which a house was built. Most of it, because it was all part of the outward spread of London in the first 35 or so years of the 20th century. And by and large, if a house had sash windows, it would have been not later than, it would have been not built not later than 1910. Casement windows largely replaced it by just before the First World War. And I think broadly speaking, the same is true here. And I don't see why we require the division of a window I'm entirely in favor of all this stuff about, picture windows and curved bow windows and all of that. Those definitely should be prohibited. But I don't see why you can't have a plain single sheet of glass which would run, 5 feet by 2.5 or whatever.
Thank you, Oliver.
That's my little list. You'll be glad to know it's not in it.
Lots of good points there, which I will allow Hillary to speak to. I saw she was frantically writing down a few things. I did want to say that it was a bit of a relief. I'm usually the one who's picking out the typographical and grammatical errors, so it's nice to see. And but I'll let Hillary speak to some of those.
Through the chair, thank you so much for the attention that you paid reading this document. And to all of you, please don't hesitate to send me any copy edit fixes that need to be made. You can imagine, having been so close to this document for so long, you get to a point where you stop seeing some of these things. To your first most substantive point, an earlier draft did have Connaught Ruland House and a statement of significance for it. That seems to have been an export error from when this plan was translated into PDF format. So that will certainly be added back in if the committee so decides. Similarly, with the small edit, where St. John's Rectory is referred to by Hall, that most certainly is a copy and paste error. To number 4, the adaptive reuse of churches. This is an area of increasing interest all across the country as we see changing demographics. To sort of build on Fawn's question earlier, I should point out that in Nova Scotia, heritage legislation applies to the exterior of buildings unless a separate motion has been made by a municipal government to protect a historic interior of a building that it owns. So it cannot protect, no municipality can protect the interior of a property it does not own. Thus, none of the churches in Lunenburg do have protected interiors. Thus, that does leave quite a lot of flexibility and room open for potential adaptive reuse in the future. However, and I apologize if it seems like I'm beating this drum too forcefully, but as St. John's is on the original 4 civic blocks, under this new heritage plan and bylaw, it is unlikely that we would support the adaptive reuse of that building unless it was going to demonstrate that it was still going to be for public use and for public benefit. So that is something to consider. The status of the buffer zone in relation to this, the UNESCO World Heritage Buffer Zone is its own animal that is set by the World Heritage Committee, and we cannot change it here at the municipal level. So again, anything that happens in that World Heritage Buffer Zone will still have to be reported to the World Heritage Committee. The transition area that is proposed under this plan and bylaw, those historic buildings, so character defining buildings, will still fall under the same regulations as those in, dare I say, Old Town proper, the original Charles Morris plan area. But once you move out into that transition zone, the requirements on new construction are slightly less. There's a lighter touch, particularly around materiality and material requirements. So they have their own, the transition area has its own guidelines around new construction in the design guidelines that are appended to the bylaw. Solar panels, these are the types of details that really fall to the committee. And I agree with you, there are certain debates that need to be had around some of these issues. And I look forward to hearing those debates and watching them unfold. 7, the need to produce pictures. I could not agree more. One of the issues that we stumbled upon as we were working on this plan and bylaw, one was time and trying to decide if we wanted to recycle old sketches from the existing plan and bylaw into the new plan and bylaw. The second issue was that you cannot regulate by image. So if these images were put directly in the document, certainly people would use them to help interpret the plan and bylaw, but you cannot legally enforce anything based on those images. So it is very important that first and foremost, the text be very strong and clear. So that was part of the thinking behind delaying the illustrations. Also, once or if a revised plan and bylaw is passed, it will then be set in stone. It will also be public, which means that we can actually use that exercise of developing some of these interpretive images as an outreach opportunity, as a way to engage young people, the artistic community, in perhaps developing an illustrated version of the plan and bylaw. So these are some of the reasons that staff chose to delay adding those things in. But again, an illustrated version is certainly top of our mind. Your last point about windows is also very apt. As I mentioned earlier, this also came up in the State of Conservation report. Again, we are a World Heritage Site because of our continuing vernacular architecture tradition. But right now, it seems that that vernacular tradition has never been defined, let alone has any sort of community consensus been built around what that continuing vernacular architecture tradition means in the present. Is there a place for a certain type of windows in our evolving vernacular tradition, or is there not? How important are these different details to continuing a vernacular architecture tradition? And all of these are things that really need to be driven by you, the committee, and by the town. Vernacular, of course, has many definitions. It's often thought of as the architecture of the untrained. So skilled craftspeople versus architects. Of course, these people are unbelievably skilled. Some have defined, for example, Steve Mannell, who's an incredible architectural historian and Dowell professor, has defined vernacular as doing what needs to be done with what is readily at hand. You know, it's architecture built to fulfill a purpose, and I think really does in some ways speak to Nova Scotian and Lunenburg culture and what our vernacular tradition might be about. But I particularly like the definition, vernacular architecture is common, is not common, but it is commonplace. So vernacular architecture is rare, it's valuable, it's a threatened tradition. They're a type of building that don't often survive into the present because they are often replaced. So they're rare and they are precious. They're not common, but they are commonplace. It's architecture built by people for people that draws on the uniqueness of the place in which they're created. So even when, for example, international design trends, whether that be classicism all the way to the international style that you seem to be alluding to in that interwar period in some of your comments. Whenever these things are translated through a vernacular tradition, they are somehow mediated and made very unique and very local. So what that means here in Lunenburg and what that means today for any future buildings or developments here in Lunenburg is certainly something that I invite the committee to think deeply about and to provide as much feedback on as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Hillary on the report? Okay, so we'll let Fawn go first and then Natalie.
Actually, just thank you. I was wondering about the maps again, just to make sure. Okay, this map, which online, my printer didn't do it very well. It's low in ink there, but this is the green one and it cut off the top. So is this the it says World Heritage Zone and the buffer zone. So that's the one you were referring to.
Through the chair, yes. And you can, and to those at home or those in the gallery, you can actually find the World Heritage Boundary and our current World Heritage Buffer Zone on the UNESCO website. So that is a map that wasn't internally made. That is a map that has been filed with UNESCO.
Okay, so that's that versus this, right? Because, for example, in our house, we're on it on one and not on it on the other. So I just wanted to make sure that I knew where, for example, we stood, which kind of, for me, a lot of my questions come from very much a consumer base user versus strictly policy writing, or a little bit, a blend of both. Because in the past, I've had the experience of working with people where often I act like an interpreter because they're overwhelmed with the wordage. So it's sort of a cry for help, like help me understand what this means. So, and often, of course, that are, if I was working with someone, it would be to restore, renovate, add on to, build new, all of that. And at this time, you know, we always have, or at any time, we always have lots that are for sale in the town where something brand new will be going on that particular lot. Even with infill within Old Town. So it's to try to figure out how to walk that line. And because I love, of course, the heritage of our town, and then someone is building new. So for starters, on page 9, I really appreciated, there was a note about compatibility on page 9. Because it's very difficult when you read through all this to not have like the Disneyfication effect when in fact you are very specifically outlining like windows and the use of these specific kinds of dormers. And it's kind of a fine line for an architect to walk when they're trying to create a new home. They understand like the scale, of course. And that's another thing I should say. Scale was mentioned. Thank you very much. That's one that a lot of people struggle with. So I would say the more you can put that scale word in there, the better. Because often, for example, when townhouses were proposed, when they were talking about infilling in the harbor, and the scale was crazy compared to what the rest of the town looked like, it would have looked massive. So anyway, the whole intention of what is there in compatibility, I almost would like to see that expanded a bit, because it does talk about, or the more you can talk about how to be compatible with a historic structure, but not duplicated in a way that's a hard one. So that because you can't totally duplicate it's a modern building in an old setting. So the more that's explained, the better for consumers to help understand how to do that. Let's see. Talked about scale. The engineers, when you mentioned about the 2 engineers in building demolition, I remember reading that and I have a hard time going back and forth and finding things when it's on the computer. So it was mentioned near the beginning about the use of engineers for demolition, the 2 engineers, but down through, it wasn't repeated again in some of the places where demolition was talked about again. And I think that's a really important point. I'm not sure how many or the difference between an engineer that, because I've dealt with a lot of structural engineers, most understand structure regardless of if it's new or old, whereas it was specifically referred to as engineers with heritage experience. I think that's how it was worded. And I'm not sure how common those folks are. I don't know. That might be a little bit difficult for a user to find unless the town has a list. I don't know. I've always found the engineers I've used to be really good, because all the buildings I've dealt with are old, really good at helping me re-support an old building or repair. One thing on policy 31, it's on page 19, sort of 17 and 19. And this comes again from users and speaking for myself too. There are times when you get caught between the town and the building inspectors in an almost catch-22 situation that's nobody's fault or anything, but there's a chasm that you can fall into where it's hard to move forward sometimes. And the current planning department, I found much more helpful, I have to say, with that. So I guess it's that role of advocacy kind of, because on the one hand, consumer is pushed to do, what we ask it as a town, whereas the building inspector comes in with the building codes and all that, and very quickly go, no, you have to do it this way. No, you have to. And then all of a sudden you've got a chunk on the side of a building, and we might come to you and say, now what do we do? We end up in this funny place. So I guess I was looking at that, and it just reminded me that it would be, and I don't know if because some people have said, who do I go to? Who's going to hold my hand at this point in time and explain that? And it's hard to move forward at those times. So, and when the town had its own building inspector, he understood a lot of that. And when I found when we switched over to the modal, I mean, they're fine and everything, but they were not equipped with the understanding of, I think they're getting better because they're getting more experience with it. But that ability to keep your building really as you're wishing in here, sometimes a little bit difficult. So yeah, just that role of advocacy. I have a lot here. Should I give Natalie a chance now? Do you want to? I'll do a little bit more and then you can switch. Okay, I did that one. Oh, archaeological resources. Could you define that for me, please? And also you have a glossary of definitions, depending on what the definition is. Could it go in there also? Yeah, because it referred to it about digging up. So I just wondered if you could define that, then I know if you could define archaeological resources, I'd know if these other things are pertinent to that.
Okay, 1 second. Should I go through all of them in order or just stick to archaeological resources for now?
Well, you may as well go through and we'll.
Okay. So absolutely, we can expand on compatibility again, if that is one of the recommendations of the committee when the time comes. Of course, the entire design guidelines have been written to try to encourage simultaneously a little more room for creativity, a little more room for the development of what neo-vernacular might be, while at the same time trying to put barriers in place to keep people within some sort of neo-vernacular range. There's always that balance between not tying people up and allowing for example, architects and builders to be able to explore and express themselves, while also creating something tight enough that those who perhaps don't have the best of intentions can't, run away with the football, for lack of a better way of putting it. But so that is certainly something to be looked into. The note is well placed about demolition. Two things I would say about the engineers. One, I think that to a certain degree, the committee would have some authority on trying to determine whether an engineering report was credible and whether an engineer had enough heritage experience to make such a determination, as this would be the first stop after my desk or whoever the heritage officer may be to evaluating a application to demolish. Also, we do have a Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals. They have an online registry. There are many engineers that are a part of that. So that is an excellent resource. Of course, the town can't recommend professionals, tradespeople, et cetera, but there are many national organizations who do that. Certainly the requirement for 2 engineering studies, it is quite a high threshold, but again, if you think of us within our World Heritage context, what would you expect to be required for someone to demolish an apartment that borders on the Eiffel Tower in Paris, or to take stones out of the pyramids, right? So when you think of it in this context, suddenly 2 engineering reports, doesn't seem quite that strict to at least come forward for consideration. Archaeological resources is not defined in the report, but it certainly can be. Of course, this provision was sort of thought up largely to address the issue of the archaeological remains of the fortifications, because they are, of course, a character-defining element under our statement of significance, and they are an underground resource. They are an archaeological resource. So that was the context in which this provision was used. I would recommend taking the definition from the relevant provincial legislation, just so that our definitions are really well aligned with all the different layers of regulatory authority that we are embedded with. So I must apologize. I don't know that definition off the top of my head, but it can certainly be added. But again, it mostly, in this context, mostly referred to the fortifications, which of course were not referenced in the 2000 version.
Is that good, Fawn? Or? No. Go ahead, Nathan.
Thank you, Chair. All right. A lot of the notes that I have kind of echo what Oliver and Fawn have said. I don't know about the casement windows, but I had mentioned prior about the KRH not having a statement of significance, so that's taken care of now. Kind of talking to around Fawn's engineering reports. I noticed in policy 40, and I just have short notes here, it refers to, let me look here, the application to demolish. And there are a number of considerations for that application there, yet the engineering reports are not identified there. So I think that would be a good place to just really cement it into that requirement. And I guess, Fawn, you've worked with heritage supporting engineers, and I guess kind of from what I've seen, there are engineers that get heritage and there are engineers that do not get heritage. Speaking as one myself, I'm a chemical engineer that likes heritage, but I'm not going to do any structural work. But I am, yeah, I think the 2 reports are good. I think I've seen evidence before of drive-by reporting analysis. So I think something a little bit more in depth is important here. And that's just speculation on my part. And a lot of my commentary, I feel, is having been involved with the past iteration of the heritage bylaw. So I'm very used to numbers. So I guess that kind of backs up some of my comments. There was another, I think these are in relative order. Section 11, you talk about penalties. And I went back to the Heritage Act with the province, and I see that there are penalties identified there, and this may be outside the realm of this, but I'm just kind of wondering if there has been any consideration within the town, probably in general, of the option of fines. My understanding with Department of Environment on a provincial level, they moved to that as a smaller hammer because of the costs involved with going to court over some of these issues. So I don't know if that issuing fines is a way of kind of correcting some of the wrongs. I do have some other questions with respect to, I guess, definitions. You used the word program in respect to size, material, and program, and I wasn't entirely sure what that referred to. Another clarification I was hoping for was public realm or visible from the public realm, and I just, again, from knowledge of the old bylaw, I'm wanting to confirm that it includes visibility from non-primary facades. And I guess talking, a question I had around the requirements for the new infill. Fawn was talking about scale, and I really like the language and that approach and the challenge behind regulating that, kind of holding people in check, but not allowing that creativity. I'm just wondering, are there any concerns around challenges from homeowners or developers or carpentry persons of what might be considered to be compatible? Again, I like numbers. They're hard. But I do appreciate the flexibility around that. Speaking to the solar panels, I'm jumping around a little bit. I am curious as to whether any solar installers were consulted for this with respect to the practicality of the requirements set forth. Because I think there's limits on the number of solar panels. And my understanding is that you tend to want to maximize the coverage on your roof to maximize the amount of solar gain that you can capture and monetize. With respect to architectural or archaeological resources, and the clarification around that, I'm just kind of wondering if there should be some sort of reference to the fact that there are provincial regulations and kind of maybe a little bit of interpretation around that to help people, because it is good to know that there are rules out there and what they should be looking at. And if you come across this when you're digging in your yard, what should be done? And I'm not entirely sure myself, other than the work that we've done with the KRH and it being a provincial heritage site, having required the area and overseeing of an archaeologist for our groundwork. I guess if I had to, no, I won't bother with that one. I was looking at Appendix E with the list of the buildings, the character defining. I don't have them written down, versus the supporting structures. One building that's kind of introduced me to my life and heritage here in Lunenburg was the Anderson Barn on Pelham Street. At that time, it had a Montague Street address, but it is adjacent to 36 Pelham Street. And I can't see that it is in that list as a supporting structure, and that would be something that some investigation possibly.
Chairman, I remember about that.
So do I. Think. I think that's good. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Hillary, you wish to speak to?
Well, thank you so much again. So absolutely, engineering reports can be added to number 40, again, if that is a recommendation that the committee so chooses to bring forward. Your point of drive-by reporting, I think, is quite apt. One of the reasons for asking for 2 reports instead of just 1 is, in my past experience in other jurisdictions, it tends, you can normally find one person who is willing to write something favorable to your desired outcome. It can be a bit harder to find 2. So that was part of the thinking behind that. We did discuss other ideas of what that could look like. And so we're certainly open to brainstorming on that. The word program is an architectural history term, and it normally means how the form of a building follows from its use. So it's very closely tied to the use of a building. So, for example, this council chamber has a certain program. The program is that it was designed to be a courtroom. Perhaps not the best example because we don't regulate interiors, but there you go. So it can, domestic versus public structures could be, for example, a difference in program. Public realm would be visible from any public space. So that would include roads, sidewalks. So visible from public streets, public areas, etc. Again, the issues around compatibility, very complicated, because again, it is that balance between enforceability, in which you are right, numbers are easier to enforce. So many inches must include X, Y, and Z. But that does have a tendency to lean more towards the Disneyfication and the reproduction of historical styles versus, say, putting a unique twist or somehow making contemporary historical aspects and historical traditions. So that is certainly a balancing act. And again, something that the committee will really have to think about and debate on what type of approach they feel is best for the town and where that balance is between allowing for creativity and allowing for enforceability. So wonderful point. Solar panels, no solar installers were consulted, but certainly that is something that we could prepare for the next meeting, prepare some notes on that for you. Certainly, it is my experience as well. That area is key. I think, again, I don't want to misquote you, but 78 solar panels for 75% of your electricity. So again, number does tend to impact how productive these things are. And so then, of course, the question becomes, what is the impact of such a physically large change on a vernacular building? How do you balance that as well? So again, something to debate. What are our priorities and how does our heritage bylaw, plan and bylaw reflect contemporary priorities? Is the push for green technologies more important than keeping original roof forms intact? Again, that I have an opinion, but really that at the end of the day falls to the committee and to the people of Lunenburg to decide. Absolutely. Again, it's good to align these things with provincial legislation. So I can certainly pull references to that sort of archaeological provincial legislation through the document. I can say internally, the Anderson Barn has been discussed many times. And again, I don't know the exact address that it's listed off the top of my head, but I can say that our planners are going through that list for the third time with a fine-tooth comb and ensuring that all the GIS mapping is accurate. So if it has been left off the list, it certainly wasn't by intention. And we will follow up on that. And I believe those are all of the major points, but I apologize if I've missed anything.
Thank you. Fawn, I understand you had a few more questions. Before I turn it over, Jenny or Oliver, do you have anything you'd like to speak?
I just wanted to add one small point on archaeology, and that is that there are a number of currently vacant lots which previously had buildings on them. And you know, whether there are interesting historical remains of foundations, etc., under the soil, perhaps may be relevant. Although I accept that it's really driven by the remains of the fortifications.
Thank you, Oliver. That's one that I certainly agree with and appreciate. I'm always that I was with my metal detector yesterday, but only a handful of nails came. Fawn, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so now on to kind of the bylaws portion of our agenda package. I was wondering first if you could just tell me, like we have the planning document and the bylaw document, and what else if I was a user, because a lot of people in this town are really, they appreciate the heritageness of the town, shall we say, and they like to read all the documents. So they would read those. What other documents for all that all of you even use? Because I know if I go in, I just, you know, and I've seen plenty of the forms like that the general contractors fill out and they don't look at this. So starting with these two, what other documents, you mentioned like visuals and things. So what other documents would there be? Because it speaks a lot to, as the documents come down to even the forms, it gets easier to understand. So it starts off, the most difficult is the actual plan and bylaws, and then it gets easier as you go on. So could I just ask that first?
Yes, and first, through the chair, first to apologize, because I don't think I spoke earlier to your question on how there can be tensions between, for example, the building code and heritage legislation. That is certainly something that has come to our attention internally. There are meetings to address this imminently. And again, that is something that is at the forefront of our concerns. The way that, for example, new accessibility legislation, the building codes and heritage conservation concerns are going to play out in Lunenburg as we move towards an accessible Nova Scotia for 2030. is again something that we consider to be an immediate and very critical issue for the town. So no clear answers as of yet, but it is certainly, it has not gone unnoticed. We do hope and plan to put out an illustrated version that will hopefully make things more approachable, easier to understand. But the design guidelines and conservation guidelines that form the back, if you will, of the bylaw, that is in many ways the meat and potatoes in terms of from a regulatory perspective. So again, on page 9 and 10 of these guidelines, there's a flow chart which has been made to hopefully help people determine what provisions they should consider when they are dealing with their specific project. So is it new construction or is it an intervention on an existing property? Is it a character defining structure or a supporting structure? You can check the appendix and then you'll see exactly what sections you should read in evaluating your project. And internally, when we, for example, receive an application, it is largely those guidelines that we are applying to evaluate the suitability of the project. However, of course, we do also consider the overarching planning intent of the town when we consider these things from a planning perspective. There are many other pieces of legislation that impact and shape development in the town. Again, the building code, our land use bylaw, our subdivision bylaw. So certainly there are a number of pieces of legislation that all fit together. But again, this plan and bylaw has really been written with an eye to creating constructional alignment so that the land use bylaw and the heritage bylaw should not, for example, be in conflict. So at least those things that fall within the town's purview, you shouldn't be caught in a runaround. The building code, for example, rests with the provincial government, not the town. So when pieces of legislation are bumping up against each other between the municipal and the provincial level, there's only so much that the town can do to intervene to smooth out those conflicts. But certainly this document has been written to make sure that minimally at the town level, you should never be caught in any sort of circular runaround. Does that answer your question?
It does. And actually, it was kind of a lead up to the exact pages that you pointed out. Because I've worked with a lot of trades and such. This would be quite hefty for them. Like if it was broken out more in A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4, that kind of format. And the same for a lot of bullets, because even as I was writing, I had to write I had to count the bullets rather than go A, B, C, D, E. So most of the bullets, if they could be switched over to 1, 2, 3, 4 or A, B, C, D or 1 point whatever, would be much easier to refer to when you're talking to one of you. But then also specifically on page 9 and 10, I know that would be, if I was struggling with it, then I know a lot of people it's hard to have patience with that kind of thing. They just want to know, what am I supposed to do? And yes, on the side, it started to break out there. So you got to number 3, like categorize your project. So you've got, now you kind of know what category you're in, but then it would seem to me, and then to the next page, it starts at 1 again. So like for me, there's a whole lot of steps after 3 that you would have to continue with in the user sense before I would be able to come see any of you. So it either would have to flip over to something in an appendix where they start the practical things, because then you have to get into, and estimating how much your project's going to be, the scope of your project, all those tangible kinds of things. So it kind of goes from sort of the academics of it into like the user portion of it. So somehow 9 and 10, but that's why I was asking, like, what other documents, like where do you flip into sort of that real practical application from just understanding. So there's the comprehension of it and then the practical application of it. And there were a number of things, like some things, another one is even color coding. If certain things were color coded together or grouped into a category. So for example, down through the document, like if you're a residential application, then things under residential are at least the headings in red, or marine is blue, or that kind of thing. Because then the way things were categorized, not all things were kind of together. You had to keep flipping down, and where so many people, and I was struggling with online, going back and forth, was a bit frustrating. So I don't know what you call that, sort of formatting it differently, I guess. And even if there was some place where the character defining elements were like, boom, super bold, so that they were like always there as a guide to follow, because they do keep coming up, sort of repeated through. So maybe if there was somewhere as a really super holding place for them, so they could always see them. So they're super obvious to everybody, because they are really good to have and really helpful. So that was some things about, okay, so just going on to a few practical things. On page 14 in 211, bullet 7, it was mentioned about flat roofs, that they're prohibited. So let me just make sure I understand that one, especially in the neo-vernacular sense, because in town there are many, especially supporting buildings, supporting structures that, and I might have it wrong, Trevor might correct me. So you have a flat roof with a wall like this. However, is it still a flat roof if it does this? So even if there's nothing here, it's just a single roof. So there's a lot of shed buildings. I have one of them actually, where it's just a single flat roof, but it's on an angle. So I guess it's an angled flat roof. What do you call that even? I guess, but the point is, but there's the thing, is it okay to have a single roof? Is the point, I guess, then.
A couple of things. One, inspiration should not be taken from supporting properties, just character defining properties. Because if you're a supporting property, you're not vernacular, and hence you shouldn't be inspiring neo-vernacular construction. So I guess that's point one. Two, there's many vernacular structures throughout Old Town that do have very shallow pitched roofs. So certainly if you have a shallow pitch, you're not flat, and hence could be allowed. Also, note that 2.1.1 only addresses new civic construction. So those guidelines are only for if we were to build a new landmark public building, for example, right? So 2.1 is for new civic buildings. 2.2 is for new commercial. And so for example, I believe that we are going to allow some flat roofs, but don't quote me on that. And then 2.3 is for new residential buildings. So again, the guidelines for each type of building do vary slightly. What you're talking about sounds more like some sort of lean-to or an outbuilding. And so then they also would fall under different categories. But if you're talking about, for example, carports, they would not be considered vernacular and then hence should not be used as an inspiration or a justification for any sort of new design construction in the district.
No, I was thinking more of almost like some mid-century modern type angled roofs, very modern, like Brian McKay Lines would use uses this kind of roof angle a lot. Is more that kind of thing. And yeah, I did know it was for new. But. Okay, so this would apply, yes, specifically in here, I guess it would have to specifically follow a dwelling versus a supporting structure.
Yes, so moving forward, new residences would need to be inspired by existing historic residences. New commercial properties would need to demonstrate that they were inspired by historic commercial properties, and new public by new public edifices. So if you were to build a new house in the district, you should be considering the historic houses that have been listed as character defining, AKA vernacular, and that contribute to the World Heritage status, in finding design inspiration for your neo-vernacular contemporary take on Lunenburg's built environment. But again, that doesn't prohibit shallow pitched roofs necessarily, because again, there are many domestic structures across town that do have very shallow pitched roofs.
Okay, thank you.
And I think with that as well, the something like the salt box style of houses have very shallow pitch and
Yes.
very much play in, especially with the heavy Newfoundland influence that's found here and so on. So that would probably be the easiest historical example that I can think of to illustrate a shallow pitch.
Thank you.
Was that, no, you're ready.
I'm still going. Under bullets, let's say 2.1 on page 15, 214, for it was materials of new civic structures. And it mentions stone. And I guess it was just I'm assuming you do mean natural stone, because there's so much, you know, in Halifax, there were, I lived in the hydrostones. And so, of course, the stone there is a man-made stone. But the city sort of changed some things. This is a few years ago, and took advantage of the wording that was used and started inserting all sorts of man-made products within the hydrostones that they never should have done. So I guess that's why when I saw that, I thought, oh, should it say natural stone just to curb that? You'd be surprised how that's taken advantage of. And under bullet 3 on the same page, on page 15, it mentions no corrugated metal, which I assume is what we traditionally think of as this kind of metal. But other metal is okay, like a standing seam roof, for example, especially a crafted one would be okay. Metal becomes in modern day, metal roofs are a little bit wonky to deal with. But yeah, I don't know how you describe it other than corrugated metal versus some of the other metal products that might be okay. I'm not quite sure how the verbiage that you would, or the words that you would use there to distinguish between the two. Some are actually quite acceptable, some not, but the whole metal roof thing is because of the demand for it. There's a quite an expanse of products now. So yeah, I guess just something to make sure it isn't the old-fashioned corrugated. On page 16, the 221 bullet 5 under form. I was wondering about, it mentions about the rooftop deck. I just wasn't quite sure. I was trying to picture in my mind what this would be. So it notes that a rooftop deck should not be on a principal roof. I'm assuming so then I was thinking, okay, if it's not on a principal roof and there's only one roof, then you can't have a roof deck, I'm assuming. So if you have a secondary roof, like if you have this and then this, you can have that on there, right?
Yes, so if your example, you had a lower roof that covered, for example, an addition, you could consider potentially putting a rooftop deck there. It doesn't necessarily preclude putting sort of balcony decks over porticos. But again, you have to be careful that they don't substantially alter the roof form of the historic building.
Right. So in that case, I was wondering, should it just mention however would be considered on a secondary roof or something? Because again, people start trying to picture, okay, how would I do that then? If I have one roof, then it's no. If I have two roofs, is, you know, so it kind of goes on and on from there. And on page 18, it talks about setbacks on bullet 4, 231, bullet 4. And it mentions it in a few places about if you are, let's say you have an empty lot and you're building on it. So you look around within your block at the different kinds of setbacks. And I know that a lot of them are immediately like on the sidewalk, which does cause problems. So if Tyson were sitting here representing the snowplow people, and also because I know a lot of people who have a lot of annual damage done to steps and railings and such, because their house, it is where it is. But it's an ongoing thing. So if you choose to follow on your street that someone has put your other homes like immediately on the sidewalk. And I know also when we were on Lincoln Street, it was impossible to put gutters on the house. So ice would free fall from way up above and we'd have to put up signs. So and I don't know what that would be, but just like a safety setback so that they aren't that close.
So the reason that we're suggesting as staff the continuation of minimal setbacks is because it's very important to reinforcing the grid. And the grid, of course, is extremely important to us being the best conserved colonial settlement. Any sort of sense of a gap tooth running down the streets of the district could have a very detrimental effect to the understanding and the visual strength of the grid. So we are recommending minimal setbacks. Now that can cause issues, of course, around encroachment. We did think of, in particular, the snow issue and are suggesting snow and ice guards on metal roofs. That is something that the committee could consider expanding and running through the document more fulsomely. Again, it's at the committee's discretion to decide what they want to recommend to council, but the lack of step backs is very critical to the integrity of the grid. So something for the committee to consider as they ponder the setback issue.
Right. And I didn't know, for example, on our same block, we were not in line. It was already like this. So I didn't know if you were in that situation and one lot was a lot you're building on. Yes, my question was more, are you allowed to choose the one closest to the sidewalk versus the town saying, well, we prefer you, if it's not already lined up, if you know what I mean?
It's on the same block. So if there's variance along the same block, you just need to be within the variance on the same block. So if you're a property owner and there's one house on your block that's right at the street line and one that's ever so slightly set back, you can take your cue from the surrounding historic structures.
From either one. Okay, good. Well, that helps to clarify. So I know the answer to that. Okay, that's setbacks. On page 19, 233, the first bullet, it mentions sunrooms. And I didn't see anywhere, and maybe it comes under something else, Because there are a lot of houses here that have original, sunrooms. But I'm assuming that's not the commercial add-on ones. How do you make sure, how do you word it so that that doesn't happen? Because in the wording, it does mention about windows coming down so far. I just wondered how you can sort of, is it appropriate other than appropriate sunrooms? Or not appropriate? Yeah, I guess appropriate sunrooms. Just how would you?
Two thoughts. One is that, of course, interventions on historic structures do have to be wooden. So there aren't a lot of prefabricated wooden sunrooms that I'm aware of. And you will note further along in the bylaw that one of the changes between this and the existing heritage plan and bylaw is that this plan and bylaw precludes the use of prefabricated sheds in the district. So certainly a provision could be added around no prefabricated structures being allowed in the district apart from, say, temporary tents or things of that nature. Again, prefabrication is sort of considered the antithesis of vernacular architecture in many respects.
Mhm.
So again, it could be something that the committee might be interested in exploring.
Thank you. And on the same page, bullet 5, it mentions picture windows, which I understand what a picture window is, but then there's also inoperable windows that are used. So picture windows are often, how would you say, they're just like huge, and they are inoperable. They are an inoperable window, but then there are inoperable windows that are okay as long as they're proportioned and yeah, as long as they follow, because you can get an inoperable window that does have like grills in it that look like, a window with sashes. So yeah, I just wondered for clarification just around the picture window thing to make sure people understand. Like there's always a line there where you cross. It's obvious if you have like a double hung sash window versus a great big picture window, but then there's somewhere in between there that's allowable and not an inoperable window.
This current draft does not regulate on operability, dare I say.
Mm.
So there's no provision saying that a window that is put in has to be operable. It does, however, preclude, as you say, picture windows. So these large expanses of glass that we were talking about earlier. Currently in the draft, they are prohibited both in new construction and their addition to historic structures.
One thing that has been talked about a lot, and I was reading under replacement on page 22 and 5.2. But one word that I couldn't find mentioned anywhere was about chimneys. And chimneys are, I know when I first came on our house, one chimney that had 2 chimneys originally, and one had already been removed. And the second one, and it was a lot of floors, it's like 4 floors, was disintegrating. And so it was just this whole thing of how you deal with chimneys, because at the time, the town and I don't know where the Heritage Society stood on that, about the removal of chimneys, but I don't see it. There was talk about replacement and removal of some things, but chimneys were never mentioned. And it's sometimes, I know in our case, structurally, it would have been dangerous to keep even the engineer agreed, because it was already on a lean, it was disintegrating, and it went through all these floors, and it was pushing against walls and leaking also. And we tried and tried. Anyway, but it's not mentioned anywhere where a lot of other things are mentioned about chimneys. And so I just mentioned that. There was a section on under certificate of appropriateness, and that's way back, but I'll mention it here also because it was kind of came up again a bit about solar panels, but it mentioned about certificate of appropriateness required for additions on a structure like a deck, a porch, a heat pump, a solar panel, that kind of thing. And as I was reading it, it sort of occurred to me that they fall kind of into two categories. So if you're relying on a heat pump for your heat, it's more of a need thing, or solar power for your home, or because it's a green, trying to be more green in your home, versus an aesthetic, which is more like a porch, that sort of thing. So I wondered with the certificate of appropriateness, when it mentioned being required, if that was just for the location of it, or was it to veto it, especially in the case of, as Oliver mentioned, solar panels on like north side facing. So I just wondered how the certificate of appropriateness worked in relation to like heat pumps, that kind of thing.
So under this draft, just as is the case now under the current heritage plan and bylaw, before you say wanted to install solar panels or heat pumps, you would have to put in an application to the town. That application would be reviewed by the heritage officer to ensure that what you were proposing adheres to the guidelines in this document. And then you could, assuming that the heritage officer does deem it to be in compliance, you could move forward with your project. So all these things that you just listed, in addition to outbuildings, fences, all of these things currently need a certificate of appropriateness under the current heritage plan and bylaw, and will also need one under this heritage plan and bylaw. The certificate of appropriateness is really the principal way that we enforce and give weight to the plan and bylaw to ensure that this document is in fact guiding physical interventions in the town.
Okay, so no change there at all.
No substantial
Okay.
change.
All right. What else was there? Setbacks. These, almost there. Right, there were some page numbers missing on some things, just to note that, but I'm sure that's just a matter of when you do clean up. And yes, at the end with the appendices at the end, they went to right, E, F, G, H, I. And then it starts, so they were around page 90 or so, and then it started at page 28 all of a sudden, sort of further down along. So yeah, just some little things like that. Yeah, I think that's most of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Fawn. Very thorough. Very good.
Sorry.
Are there any other questions? Is there anything else to be discussed? Oliver,
Can I
you-
just come back briefly on the window thing? I mean, I was talking about means of opening, but I'm not suggesting that windows must open. I mean, the largest room in our house has 9 identically sized windows on 3 walls, 3 external walls, of which only 4 can be opened, because we reckoned that that was quite adequate for cross ventilation. And why pay the extra for having opening ones as against fixed ones? But they look all absolutely identical from the outside.
My own house has a historical inoperable window, just because of the fact that it's built into a hill. And so the tops of the windows line up. It's only a single sash instead of a double hung. So yes, thank you. If there are no further, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, enough.
Thank you, Chair. I'm thinking of Fawn's comments on the usability of the document. I don't know where, there's something in there about where the houses or the buildings are located. And I'm just curious, looking at map 2, which is Appendix C. I don't know which document. I think it's the bylaws, where it has the different colors. So the residential zone is deemed as the yellow, or the residential area. And then red is the commercial area. But there are homes, residences in the commercial area. So is there a difference between how a residence is handled in the commercial area versus the residential area?
Really wonderful question. These zones are primarily for new construction, and it aligns with with our land use bylaw.
Okay.
So residences should be built in the residential zone, commercial businesses built in the commercial zone. Of course, my fellow planners can attest that it's always a little more complicated than that, but for the sake of this review. It's important to note that, again, the historic structures are categorized by type. So the way that you would treat a historic home that, for example, is currently used as a business will be different than a historic commercial structure that was built as a commercial structure and has always been a commercial structure.
Mhm.
So for example, if you have what was once a historic home that is now in the commercial district, you can't simply rip out everything on the ground floor and put in a mock historic storefront with massive windows, right? We still want to keep that historic fabric intact. So these zones primarily guide new construction, not the treatment of historic structures.
Thank you. One other question, please. More administrative, I guess. I have many more notes. Is there a better way of, should I be summarizing them and sending them to you?
Well, this is a through the chair. This is a wonderful point to bring up, because the next memo that is on the agenda is, of course, the public participation program, and that outlines the 6 different opportunities that, again, if voted upon by the committee, any member of the public, including yourselves, can use to provide feedback. And of course, one of those is in writing. So if there are more detailed feedback that you want to give me at any time, you can do so.
Going once, going twice, going 3 times. Any more questions from the committee? Okay, thank you. Those were some very thorough and very excellent questions, I want to say. And I'm sure the Heritage and Planning Department will take all of them into consideration. And so I want to thank the committee for their diligence in looking it all over. So to Hillary, what you just brought up, our final item of business is 6.3, the Heritage Conservation District Plan and Bylaw Public Participation Schedule. Do either of you have something to say to that? Okay.
Thank you for your patience, as this is the last agenda item this evening. Staff is seeking the Heritage Advisory Committee's approval of a public participation schedule that goes above and beyond the requirements outlined under the Provincial Heritage Conservation District regulations and the town's own procedural policy, which was adopted August 9th, 2022. If approved, the Heritage Advisory Committee would be using their discretion under Section 3 of the town's policy to increase public participation in reviewing the draft Old Town Lunenburg Heritage Conservation District Plan and Bylaw. The draft cannot move forward without the Heritage Advisory Committee undertaking, at minimum, a public participation meeting. The schedule proposed is that tonight, the Heritage Advisory Committee would enact the proposed public participation schedule. This would trigger 6 ways for the public to provide feedback on the draft documents before you. First, staff would host 3 open houses, offering residents a chance to view the proposal, ask questions, and provide feedback, much as you have yourselves this evening. These include tentatively a workshop or open house June 15th at the Fire Hall, an online open house on June 19th, and a pop-up in the Heritage Bandstand on June 25th. Next, residents may email their comments to a new email address, ourheritage@townoflunenburg.ca. Submissions received by 6 p.m. on June 21st would be appended to the June 26th Heritage Advisory Committee agenda package. Submissions received by 6 p.m. on July 2nd will be appended to the July 11th Heritage Advisory Committee agenda package. This schedule also applies to submissions made by mail, the 5th way people may provide feedback on the draft heritage plan and bylaw. Lastly, there will be a public participation meeting before this committee. Anyone can join in person or via Zoom on June 26th at 6 p.m. Residents may sign up to present before you, the committee, that same day when they join the meeting in person or online. To ensure as many people as possible know about these opportunities, staff propose publicizing the public participation schedule on the town's website and social media. An advertisement will appear in the Lighthouse Now Progress Bulletin on June 14th and June 21st. Also, we will send a letter to every property owner in the proposed district boundary. We would also like, again with the committee's blessing, to send letters to those who own property in the Tannery Road Architectural Control Area. After the public participation meeting, tentatively June 26, staff will prepare a What We Heard report summarizing all the feedback received. This will be shared with the committee and be made publicly available on the town's website. On July 3rd, the committee will meet again, having reviewed the report and potentially make a recommendation to council, including any changes they would like to see made to the draft plan and bylaw. All of these activities are within the town's budget for passing the new Old Town Lunenburg Heritage Conservation District Plan and bylaw. Staff will not need to seek additional funds from council. Again, increasing public participation and expanding the scope of communication to include the architectural control area residents would demonstrate the Heritage Advisory Committee's commitment and intention to making every reasonable effort to seek the public's opinion on all relevant matters pertaining to the draft heritage plan and bylaw. Thank you.
Thank you. So there is a motion provided for the purposes of those in the gallery and those tuning in at home. It reads, moved and seconded that the Heritage Advisory Committee approve the Old Town Lunenburg Heritage Conservation District public participation schedule as outlined in Appendix A, Old Town Lunenburg Heritage Conservation District public participation schedule. Do I have a mover and seconder to that motion? Moved by Jenny, seconded by Fawn. Thank you. Is there any discussion on the motion?
There's just 2 things I'd like to ask. One is presumably if we get so much feedback that it's not feasible to deal with it all in one meeting on the whatever it was of July, we might need to have more than one. But the other thing, and which is actually I think even more important to say, is the location of the June 26th meeting. I wouldn't wish us to be involved in a repetition of the problem of the night when the proposed bylaw about food trucks was being held, because there was a lot of feeling that that was a mistake. To have people forced to be out in the corridor where they couldn't really hear and all of that.
Thank you. I'd like to I'd pose that question to the Community Development Department would you look in to see if there is an opportunity for another location? Or at the very least gauge from the outreach that may come over leading up to this day, how many people might be expected to show or however you may wish to look at it.
Again, we take our direction from the committee. So if this is something that committee would like us to explore, we most certainly will.
All right, well, if that's it.
Having raised it, I mean, I fully recognize that the advantage of this room is that the whole thing is set up in terms of, you know, being able to use Zoom and everything else. But it would be very unfortunate if there were sufficient interest in that meeting that people were excluded from it.
Yeah, very much so. If that being the case, would you like to suggest an amendment to the motion to allow for the committee to look into an alternate location to hold this, to hold the public participation meeting?
I think I would just actually endorse what you yourself said, Mr. Chairman, that perhaps if staff could explore that. I mean, it may well be that the fact that there will have been 3 open house occasions before that will deal with the question of popularity of attendance. I don't know. But and I mean, the difficulty is there's no reasonable mechanism for discovering how many people are likely to turn out.
Well, I suppose if it's viable to look at other locations, I suppose we should entertain that and see what is available. So with would I be able to leave that with staff to look into?
Yes. One thing that I would request is just that staff is somewhat empowered to make a decision one way or the other, because of course the location will have to be known before we, for example, can advertise, we can send out letters, we can post things in the paper, and all of those things need to happen very quickly after tonight's meeting. Of course, the Heritage Committee is not scheduled to meet again between now and said public participation meeting. So we can certainly do as much due diligence as we can, but staff will need to make a decision on that sooner than later, and we may not have an opportunity to come back to the committee.
Of course, understandable. So I guess what I would look for is consent from the committee to that effect.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to assume that we're giving that, you know, that responsibility to you in consultation with Councillor Ernst, really. I think that's.
And absolutely, and I'll certainly be in contact with the department and see what we can figure out. Oh, yes, Natalie.
Just one correction on the letter with Appendix B. It's Town of Lunenburg procedural policy. The year is 2023, so it's as approved by council on August 9th, 2023. So I believe that should be 2022. I assume.
We were getting a little ahead of ourselves, I suppose.
Okay. But I'd be in favor of giving the staff permission or support them in moving the venue.
Thank you. Then, so the motion has been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion, Fawn?
Letters that go out to people. So on this map, what would we be, who exactly will be getting letters?
Through the chair, everyone encompassed in that area will receive a letter.
This area?
Yes, the entire district, including the transition area and anyone, the area currently shown on the screen. Also, in addition to all the people included in this area, would be everyone who currently lives in the architectural control area along Tannery Road, as is outlined in the town's land use bylaw.
Okay, thank you. And one other question, or not a question, just a request. Often on the town Facebook site, meetings are announced, which is a good thing in terms of planning, far back from when the meeting is held, but then not necessarily on the day. So I've had to request a couple times, like on the day, and especially the link, even though today the link wasn't operable, but if they could be posted on that time. In my experience for these things, there's never too many reminders for people. Thank you.
Thank you, and a good point for sure. Any other discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor? Contrary minded? The motion is carried, and with no further business, the next meeting will be the public participation meeting, which will be held Monday, June 26th at 6 o'clock at a location to be determined. And with no further business, I declare the meeting adjourned.